What if the most dangerous man in the United States during the Korean War was not fighting on the front lines in Korea, but sitting behind a desk in Tokyo, commanding an army he believed was entirely his own? What if the general who had saved the Pacific, who had accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri, who had been celebrated as a living legend of American military power, had quietly begun to act as though the President of the United States no longer had the authority to tell him what to do? This is not a hypothetical scenario pulled from the pages of a political thriller. This is the documented, factual, and deeply consequential story of how General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most decorated and celebrated military commanders in American history, pushed the boundaries of civilian authority so far that President Harry S. Truman, a man who had never attended a military academy and had served only as an artillery captain in World War I, was forced to make one of the most explosive decisions ever recorded in the history of American command. The tension between these two men did not begin with a single argument or a single order. It built slowly, dangerously, and inevitably through a series of strategic disagreements, public defiances, and military calculations involving troop numbers that reached as high as 250,000 men deployed across the Korean peninsula. If this story already has your attention, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history, because the truth of what happened between Truman and MacArthur is more dramatic than most people realize, and the comments section is waiting for you to tell us what part of this story surprised you the most. Every like and subscription helps this kind of serious historical storytelling reach more people who deserve to know what really happened in the corridors of power during the Korean War. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, they did so with Soviet-supplied tanks, disciplined infantry divisions, and the confidence of a force that believed South Korea would fall within days. They were nearly right. The Republic of Korea army collapsed under the assault, and within 72 hours, Seoul had fallen. President Truman, without waiting for a formal declaration of war from Congress, authorized American military intervention under the banner of a United Nations police action. The man he turned to was Douglas MacArthur, then 70 years old, serving as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, a figure of such enormous prestige and institutional weight that few men in Washington dared to challenge him openly. MacArthur was given command of United Nations forces, a multinational effort that was, in practical terms, overwhelmingly American, and he immediately began planning not just to stop the North Korean advance but to destroy it completely. The early weeks of the conflict were catastrophic for American and South Korean forces. The initial American units rushed from Japan. Men of the 24th Infantry Division under Major General William F. Dean were poorly trained, under-equipped, and psychologically unprepared for the ferocity of the North Korean People's Army. Dean himself was captured near Taichung on July 20, 1950, becoming the highest-ranking American prisoner of war in the conflict. The defensive perimeter shrank to a small rectangle of territory around the port city of Pusan, a desperate last stand that became known as the Pusan Perimeter. MacArthur, watching from his headquarters at the Daiichi building in Tokyo, was already thinking far beyond simple defense. He was designing one of the boldest amphibious operations in military history, a landing at Incheon, a port city on the western coast of Korea with some of the most treacherous tidal conditions in the world. The Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington thought the plan was excessively risky. MacArthur told them that the very difficulty of the landing was what made it brilliant, because the enemy would never expect it. On September 15, 1950, United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches at Incheon. The operation was a stunning success. Within 2 weeks, Seoul had been liberated, the North Korean supply lines had been severed, and the entire strategic situation on the peninsula had been transformed. MacArthur's reputation, already towering, reached new heights. Newspapers across the United States celebrated him as a military genius. In Washington, even those who had doubted him were silenced by the scale of the victory. President Truman flew to Wake Island on October 15, 1950, to meet MacArthur in person, a meeting photographed and broadcast widely, a gesture intended to demonstrate unity between the commander-in-chief and his most famous general. At that meeting, MacArthur told Truman that Chinese intervention in the war was highly unlikely. He was profoundly, catastrophically wrong. On October 19, 1950, Chinese People's Volunteer Army forces began crossing the Yalu River into North Korea in massive numbers. Commander Pang De-hwai led approximately 300,000 troops in the initial waves of what Beijing called a volunteer operation, a fiction designed to avoid a formal declaration of war against the United States. MacArthur's intelligence apparatus had either missed the movement entirely or dramatically underestimated its scale. When the Chinese struck American and United Nations forces in late October and again in a massive offensive on November 25, 1950, the results were catastrophic. The Eighth Army under General Walton Walker was driven back in chaos. The 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir fought one of the most brutal rearguard actions in American military history, withdrawing 78 miles in freezing temperatures against overwhelming Chinese forces. By December 1950, United Nations forces had been pushed back below the 38th parallel, and the strategic situation had completely reversed. It was during this period of crisis and humiliation that the fundamental disagreement between Truman and MacArthur began to crystallize into something far more dangerous than a policy dispute. MacArthur wanted to expand the war dramatically. He advocated for bombing Chinese bases across the Yalu River in Manchuria, for a naval blockade of the Chinese coast, and for the deployment of nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek onto the Korean mainland. He also began discussing the potential use of between 30 and 50 atomic bombs to create a radioactive barrier across the neck of the Manchurian Peninsula. Truman and his advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff under General Omar Bradley, were determined to keep the conflict limited. Their fear was not simply military. It was global. A wider war with China risked drawing in the Soviet Union, and in 1950, the Soviets had already tested their first atomic bomb. Bradley would later summarize the administration's position with one of the most quoted lines in modern American military history, describing a wider war against China as the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and against the wrong enemy. The troop deployment figures at the heart of this conflict were staggering in their implications. By late 1950 and into early 1951, American forces in Korea numbered approximately 178,000, operating alongside South Korean, British, Australian, Canadian, Turkish, and other United Nations contingents for a combined strength approaching 350,000. MacArthur consistently argued that without dramatic reinforcement, without a willingness to commit far greater American strength, the war could not be won on acceptable terms. His requests and public statements implied a vision of total military commitment that could have required 250,000 additional American troops or more, a figure that alarmed Washington not only for its logistical implications but for what it signaled about MacArthur's strategic intentions. He was not thinking about a limited war. He was thinking about a war of annihilation against Chinese communism itself, a war that could have engulfed all of Asia. The breaking point came not with a single dramatic confrontation, but through a series of public acts of insubordination that Truman found intolerable. In August 1950, MacArthur had sent a message to the veterans of foreign wars that was openly critical of Truman's policy toward Taiwan, a message so politically charged that Truman ordered it withdrawn. In March 1951, as the administration was preparing a diplomatic initiative to negotiate a ceasefire, MacArthur issued his own public ultimatum to the Chinese commander, threatening to expand the war and effectively destroying any possibility of quiet diplomacy. Then, on March 20, 1951, House Republican Minority Leader Joseph Martin read a letter from MacArthur on the floor of Congress, a letter in which the general publicly endorsed a policy position diametrically opposed to the president's. MacArthur had written that there was no substitute for victory, a phrase that rang out across American political life like a challenge thrown directly at the White House. Right here, at the midpoint of this extraordinary story, take a moment to like this video if you are learning something you did not know before, subscribe to the channel if you want more historical content told with this kind of depth and honesty, share this video with someone who thinks they already know everything about the Korean War, and drop a comment below telling us what detail from this story has surprised you the most, because the next chapter of what happened between Truman and MacArthur is the part that most history books either rush through or get completely wrong. Truman's reaction to the Martin letter was controlled on the surface but volcanic underneath. He consulted with Dean Acheson, George Marshall, Averell Harriman, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff through a series of meetings beginning on April 6, 1951. The Joint Chiefs, despite their respect for MacArthur's military record, unanimously agreed that his public defiance of presidential authority was intolerable and that his strategic vision risked a third world war. Omar Bradley, Lawton Collins, Hoyt Vandenberg, and Forrest Sherman all concurred. Marshall, who had known MacArthur since before World War II and had a long and complicated relationship with him, agreed that relief was necessary. On the evening of April 10, 1951, Truman signed the orders relieving General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of all his commands, including Supreme Commander of United Nations Forces in Korea, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers in Japan, and Commander-in-Chief of United States Army Forces in the Far East. It was one of the most consequential personnel decisions in the history of American civil-military relations. The manner in which MacArthur learned of his relief became itself a story of bureaucratic confusion and political embarrassment. The administration had intended for Army Secretary Frank Pace, who was visiting Korea at the time, to personally inform MacArthur of the decision. When it appeared that the news might leak to the press before Pace could reach him, the White House arranged for the announcement to be transmitted directly. MacArthur reportedly learned of his dismissal from his wife Jean, who had heard it through an aide who had received a radio report, before any formal notification reached him. He was sitting in Tokyo, at a luncheon, on April 11, 1951, when the news arrived. The reaction across the United States was immediate and ferocious. Truman's approval ratings, already low, collapsed further. Telegrams flooded the White House at a ratio reported to be overwhelmingly in MacArthur's favor. Some members of Congress called for Truman's impeachment. Senator Joseph McCarthy called the president a drunk. The general returned home to a hero's welcome, addressing a joint session of Congress on April 19, 1951, delivering the famous speech in which he quoted the old West Point ballad about old soldiers never dying, only fading away. What the public celebration obscured was the substance of what Truman had actually done and why it mattered so profoundly to every generation that followed. The principle at stake was not personal. It was constitutional. Article 2 of the United States Constitution designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. This was not a ceremonial title. It was the foundational mechanism by which a democratic republic maintains control over its own military power. MacArthur had not simply disagreed with Truman's policy. He had publicly contradicted it, undermined diplomatic efforts, and communicated directly with members of Congress in ways explicitly designed to force a change in presidential strategy. If Truman had not acted, the implicit message to every future military commander would have been that sufficiently popular generals could effectively override civilian authority. The Senate hearings that followed MacArthur's dismissal, conducted by the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees from May through June 1951, ultimately validated Truman's decision, though the transcripts ran to more than 2 million words and were only partially released to the public at the time. The Korean War itself ground on for more than 2 additional years after MacArthur's relief. General Matthew Ridgway replaced him, later succeeded by General Mark Clark. Armistice negotiations began at Kaesong in July 1951 and moved to Panmunjom, dragging through complex arguments about prisoner repatriation and territorial boundaries. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had campaigned partly on a promise to end the war. The final ceasefire line ran almost exactly along the 38th parallel, essentially where the war had begun. Approximately 36,000 American military personnel had died in the conflict. South Korean military and civilian casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Chinese and North Korean losses were estimated in the millions. The peninsula remained divided, as it does to this day, a living consequence of the decisions made in those desperate months of 1950 and 1951, decisions about how many troops to commit, how far to advance, and most fundamentally, who had the authority to decide. Douglas MacArthur never held another military command. He lived until April 5, 1964, dying at the age of 84 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington. Harry Truman left office in January 1953 with historically low approval ratings, widely considered at the time to have been a failed president. History revised that judgment dramatically. Truman is now ranked consistently among the top 10 American presidents by historians and scholars, recognized precisely for the courage it required to fire the most popular general in America at the height of a war, to defend a constitutional principle that the public in that moment did not fully understand or appreciate. The story of Truman and MacArthur is ultimately not a story about 2 men. It is a story about the kind of republic the United States chose to be, a country where the law governs even its greatest heroes, where no uniform, no matter how decorated, can override the authority of an elected civilian government. If that story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know before, please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video so that more people can find it, share it with someone who loves history or who needs to understand why civilian control of the military still matters today, and leave a comment below telling us what moment in this story struck you most deeply, because these stories deserve to be told, remembered, and passed forward to every generation that comes after.